She was 20 years old the night her aunt's husband set her trunk out on the porch and told her the house had never truly been hers to claim, no matter how many years she'd scrubbed its floors and nursed the woman who raised her. Her name was Clara Voss, and when her Aunt Prudence died of a winter fever, Clara's uncle by marriage, a hard, calculating man named Otis Feld, wasted no time reminding her that blood, not kindness, decided who inherited a roof in Solace Point, Oregon. All she carried away that night was a canvas grip, a small tin of coins amounting to $8 and change, and a stubborn refusal to beg. With that $8, she did the one thing the whole fishing town agreed was pure foolishness. She bought the crooked, wind-battered house that leaned out over Solace Point's crumbling sea cliff, a place folks called the widow's perch because every soul who'd ever owned it had died, broke, alone, or both. She paid $7 for 4 canting walls and a chimney the wind moaned through like a grieving thing. She did not know, signing that deed by lantern light, that behind the hearth of that ruined house lay a sealed passage that would uncover a 50-year theft and give a drowning town back the harbor it had been robbed of. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Clara Voss. Before we go further, if you've ever been told the thing you wanted was worthless, or foolish, or beneath you, we want you to know we made this story with you in mind. And if these quiet, restoring kinds of stories mean something to you, we'd be so grateful if you'd follow or subscribe to our channel so you never miss the next one. We'd also love to know where you're watching from tonight, so please tell us in the comments. Now, let us take you back to where Clara's story really begins. Clara Voss was born in the spring of 1874 in a narrow saltbox house 2 streets up from the Solace Point wharf, the only child of a fisherman named Amos Voss and his wife Delia, who died bringing Clara into the world on a night so stormy that the midwife later swore the whole house had shuddered like a ship taking water. Amos never remarried, and he raised his daughter the way he mended his own nets, patiently, thoroughly, expecting her to learn every knot until her hands could tie it faster than her mind could think it through. He taught her to read the tide tables before she could properly read a primer, taught her the names of every reef and rock along that treacherous stretch of coast, and taught her, above all, that the sea did not reward carelessness, only attention. Clara grew up barefoot on the docks, quick with rope and tar, welcome aboard her father's boat when other men's daughters were kept home to sew. And by the time she was 12, she could read an incoming fog bank the way other children read a clock, could tell by the particular hush of the gulls when a storm was building past the horizon. When Clara was 9, her father's younger sister, Prudence, married Otis Feld, a Solace Point merchant who ran the general store and, in time, a modest fleet of trading schooners along the coast. Prudence was a gentle, soft-spoken woman, nothing like her brother in temperament, but she loved Amos dearly. And when Amos was lost at sea in a sudden squall the year Clara turned 14, it was Prudence who took the grieving girl in without a second thought over the visible irritation of her husband. Otis had never wanted the responsibility of a niece, had made that plain enough in 100 small, cold ways over the years. But Prudence's will was quiet and unshakable where her husband's greed was concerned. And so Clara grew up in the Feld household on the strength of her aunt's love alone, sleeping in a narrow attic room, doing the mending and the marketing, and learning, in that house, an entirely different education than the one her father had given her. How to read a ledger, how to weigh goods honestly, how to notice when a man's figures didn't quite add up, a skill Prudence taught her almost as a form of quiet rebellion against a husband whose own books, Clara would later understand, rarely balanced by accident. It was Prudence, too, who first told Clara the old story of the Solace Point harbor works, on a rainy afternoon when Clara was 16 and restless with the tedium of the store. 50 years before, Prudence explained, when the town was young and its harbor treacherous with hidden rocks, a wealthy sea captain named Josiah Wren had willed a considerable fortune to the town upon his death. Funds meant specifically to build a proper breakwater and deepen the harbor channel, so that Solace Point's fishing fleet might finally have safe anchorage in a storm, instead of losing boats and men to the rocks nearly every winter. The funds, Prudence said, her voice dropping the way it always did when she told this particular story, had simply vanished before the breakwater was ever built. The town elders of the time claimed Captain Wren's fortune had been overstated, that his estate was smaller than rumored, that there had never been as much money as the old sailors liked to claim over their rum. But the fishing families who lost sons and husbands to that same unprotected harbor in the decades since never quite believed it. And the story of Captain Wren's lost fortune became, like so many things in a small coastal town, a wound the whole community carried without ever naming it directly. Clara loved that story not because she believed in ghosts or curses, but because, like her father's lessons in Tide and Knot, it was a puzzle with an answer hiding somewhere in plain sight, waiting for someone patient enough to notice it. She did not know, sitting in her aunt's kitchen at 16, that she would spend her 20th year proving the story true, and that the noticing would nearly cost her everything before it gave the whole town back what it had lost. Prudence died of a winter fever when Clara was 20, a slow illness that Clara nursed through 3 difficult months, sitting up through the worst nights, reading aloud from the same worn Bible Prudence had once read to her as a grieving 14-year-old girl. In the numb days after the funeral, Otis Feld wasted no time making his intentions clear. He informed Clara, with the flat efficiency of a man closing out a business arrangement, that the household accounts had never formally recognized her as anything more than a live-in ward, that Prudence's modest personal savings passed to him as her legal husband, and that Clara, now a grown woman of 20 with no blood claim on his household, would need to make her own arrangements. He offered her, almost as an afterthought, a position as a stock girl in his store at a wage barely enough to keep her fed, an offer delivered less out of generosity than out of a wish to keep a useful pair of hands nearby at the lowest possible cost. Solace Point, as small towns so often do, watched this happen with a kind of helpless, murmuring sympathy that changed nothing. A few of the fishing wives brought her bread and would not quite meet her eyes, the way people avoid looking directly at a misfortune they fear might be catching. The town's one attorney, a tired, overworked man named Holloway, told her honestly that without a written will naming her as heir, and with Otis controlling every document that might have proven otherwise, she had no real legal ground to stand on. Clara declined the position in the store within the week, packed her canvas grip with what few things were truly hers: her father's old compass, her mother's shawl, a small tin of savings she had quietly kept aside from years of market errands, and walked out of the Feld house with her chin level and her eyes dry, though her hands, she would admit years later, had not stopped trembling for hours. She took a room for 2 nights above the fish cannery, paid for with coin she could not spare, and spent those nights doing what her father had taught her to do, with any problem too large to face head-on. She walked out along the cliffs above the harbor, where the wind off the water always seemed to blow her thoughts into some kind of order. It was on the second of those walks that she passed, as she had passed 100 times in her life without truly seeing it, the crooked, weather-blackened house perched at the very edge of Solace Point's northern cliff, abandoned for as long as anyone could remember, its walls canted at an angle that made it look, in the fog, like a ship listing in its final moments before going under. A faded county notice nailed to its door announced a tax auction, minimum bid $7, structure condemned, sold as is, no warranty of soundness. Clara stood there a long while in the salt wind, remembering her father telling her once, half in jest, that the old house had been built too close to the cliff edge by a man too stubborn to admit his mistake, and that its crookedness had less to do with poor construction than with the ground beneath it slowly giving way to the sea over the decades. Everyone else in Solace Point saw $7 worth of collapsing timber and bad luck. Clara saw, for reasons she could not entirely explain even to herself, a stubborn house that had refused to fall for 50 years, much like she intended to refuse now. She placed the winning bid 3 days later, and the county clerk, a young man named Dwight who'd gone to school with her, actually laughed as he stamped the deed, telling her not unkindly that she'd have been better off keeping her $7 for bread. Clara only thanked him, folded the deed carefully alongside her father's compass, and walked the 1.5 miles out to the widow's perch, with the last of her savings, a small hatchet, a coil of rope, and the particular steady calm of a woman who has already lost everything a person can lose, and therefore has very little left to fear losing. The house was worse up close than it had looked from a comfortable distance her whole life. The eastern wall had separated visibly from the foundation. The roof sagged dangerously over what had once been a small bedroom, and the whole structure groaned in even a moderate wind like something alive and in pain. But the great stone hearth at the center of the house stood remarkably solid. Built, Clara guessed, by hands far more careful than whoever had framed the rest of the place. Its river stones fitted so tightly that not even 50 years of coastal storms had loosened them. It was on her third night camping in the one dry corner of the house, feeding a small fire in that very hearth for warmth, that Clara noticed something her father's training in reading tide-worn rock had taught her to notice. One stone at the hearth's rear, low near the floor, sat at a subtly different angle than its neighbors, its mortar line thinner, newer somehow. Though newer by 50 years, was still very old indeed. It took her 2 full days of careful, quiet work with her hatchet and a borrowed iron bar to work that stone free without bringing the ash-choked chimney down around her ears. When it finally gave way, cold, salt-smelling air breathed out of the darkness behind it. Air that had no business existing behind a solid cliffside hearth, and Clara understood, kneeling there in the firelight, with her heart hammering, that she had found not a stone at all, but a door, and behind it, a narrow passage cut directly into the cliff rock, sloping downward into darkness toward what she could only assume, from the sound of distant water, was the sea itself. She did not enter that first night, prudence winning out over curiosity, but returned the next morning with a lantern, her father's old sailor's rope, and a folded oilcloth, in case whatever she found needed protecting from damp. The passage, once she'd worked up the nerve to follow it, descended perhaps 40 feet through solid rock, clearly cut by hand and shored in places with old ship's timber, opening finally into a modest sea cave at the base of the cliff, accessible from open water only at the lowest tides, hidden the rest of the time behind a curtain of rock and surf. And there, in a dry alcove above the highest tide line, wrapped in oilcloth gone stiff with age exactly as she had hoped, Clara found a ship's strongbox, its brass fittings green with corrosion, and beside it, a leather logbook whose cover bore, tooled faintly into the leather, the initials J.R. The logbook, once Clara had carefully dried and opened it by lantern light back up in the house, told a story far stranger than the simple tale of a lost fortune the town had settled on. It was Captain Josiah Wren's own private ledger, written in a careful, seafaring hand, documenting not merely his final voyage but his growing suspicion, in his last years, that the harbor funds he had willed to Solace Point were being quietly diverted before they ever reached the town's official accounts. He wrote of a business partner and fellow merchant, a man named Cornelius Feld, entrusted with managing the estate's disbursement to the town elders, who had begun, in the months before Wren's death, making unusually large private purchases of land along the harbor's edge. Land that would, Wren suspected, become extraordinarily valuable the moment a proper breakwater was built, and correspondingly worthless if the harbor remained as treacherous as it had always been. Wren's final entries grew increasingly urgent. He wrote that he had begun secretly withdrawing a portion of the harbor funds himself, converting them into gold and bonds, hiding them here in this very sea cave beneath his own newly built cliffside house, trusting the cave's hidden entrance and the treacherous tides guarding it to keep the money safe until he could arrange for its proper, transparent transfer to the town council. A transfer his failing health, and then his death, prevented him from ever completing. His last entry, dated mere days before his death, asked simply that whoever found this account see that the harbor was finally built, and that the name Feld be remembered honestly for whatever part it had played in denying the town what was rightfully its own. Clara sat with that logbook in her lap, long after her small fire had burned to embers, her hands unsteady, the name Feld ringing in her ears with a bitterness that had nothing to do with old family history and everything to do with the uncle who had put her out on a porch not 3 weeks before. She spent the following morning at the county records office, where young Dwight the clerk, curious now despite himself, helped her trace the Feld family's landholdings back across 5 decades. And there it was, plain in the old deed books. Cornelius Feld, Otis's own great-grandfather, had indeed purchased extensive parcels along the Solace Point waterfront in the very years the harbor funds disappeared, land that had passed down quietly through the Feld family ever since, forming the very foundation of the wealth that let Otis run his store and his schooners and evict his own niece without a second thought. Word travels fast along a wharf, and it was barely a week before Otis Feld himself arrived at the widow's perch, his careful merchant's smile stretched thin over something considerably less friendly underneath. He had heard, he said, that his late uncle's foolish niece had gone digging around in an old ruin and found some worthless old junk, and he was prepared, out of family generosity he had shown no evidence of before, to take whatever she'd found off her hands and see it properly disposed of. When Clara, calm but immovable, told him she intended no such thing, Otis's tone shifted quickly from false warmth to open threat, reminding her that she owned nothing but a condemned house on a collapsing cliff, that she had no standing in this town, no family to speak for her, and that a woman alone making wild claims about buried treasure and old family secrets would find herself laughed out of every parlor in Solace Point long before anyone took her seriously. He was not entirely wrong to worry about being laughed out of a parlor himself, Clara realized later, which was precisely why his fear had turned so quickly to menace. Clara understood, watching Otis stride back down the cliff path with his shoulders set in barely restrained fury, that she was facing the same kind of respectable, small-town theft that had already cost her a home once, and she resolved this time to be ready before he could act. She spent the following days not confronting him directly, but preparing carefully, carrying Captain Wren's logbook, along with the strongbox's contents of gold coin, bonds, and a formal, signed letter of intent regarding the harbor funds, to the Regional Maritime Commissioner's office 2 towns over, where an official named Bertram Cole, intrigued by so extraordinary a claim, agreed to examine the documents personally, and confirmed, after several days of careful review, that the bonds, though decades old, remained valid financial instruments, and that Captain Wren's original harbor bequest had remarkably never been formally rescinded by the town, only left unfunded and quietly forgotten. The confrontation came, as Clara had planned it, on a Sunday when the whole town gathered at the harbor for the small memorial service Solace Point held each year for fishermen lost to the treacherous, unprotected waters, a service that had, without anyone quite intending it, become a yearly reminder of exactly what the town had never gotten around to fixing. Clara stood near the old wharf bell, Captain Wren's logbook in her hands, and asked, quietly at first, and then with rising clarity, whether the townsfolk gathered there would care to finally hear the true reason their harbor had never been made safe. She read aloud from Wren's own hand, his suspicions, his final, urgent entries, and then produced the deed records tracing the Feld family's waterfront fortune directly to the years the harbor funds vanished. Otis Feld, standing near the back of the gathered crowd exactly as Garrett Whitlock had once stood in a different town square, went pale and then furious. But Commissioner Cole, who had traveled out specifically to witness this public disclosure, confirmed before the whole assembled town that the documents were genuine, that the bonds remained valid, and that the matter of the diverted funds would now be formally investigated by the Territorial Maritime Authority. There was no forged will left for Otis to hide behind, no clerk left willing to look the other way. Nothing but a dead captain's own careful handwriting standing between him and the truth the whole town had waited 50 years to hear. What followed was not vengeance, though few in Solace Point would have blamed Clara for wanting it. She insisted before the commissioner and the gathered town that the recovered funds be used exactly as Captain Wren had always intended, to finally build the breakwater and deepen the channel that would give the fishing fleet safe harbor in a storm, work that broke ground within the year and employed half the town's idle winter hands in its building. She testified plainly and without cruelty about her own eviction and the informal, undocumented nature of her claim to Prudence's household. And though the law could do little to formally restore what had never been properly hers on paper, the public shame of Otis Feld's family history proved a harsher correction than any court might have managed. His store losing custom, his schooners finding fewer willing crews, his name spoken in Solace Point from then on, with the particular cool distance a small town reserves for those who have been quietly, thoroughly seen through. The breakwater was completed the following autumn, and Clara Voss, 21 years old by then, stood on the rebuilt harbor wall and watched the fishing fleet ride out a genuine coastal storm for the first time in Solace Point's history, without losing a single boat to the rocks that had claimed her own father years before. She restored the widow's perch not as a monument to her own cleverness, but as a modest harbor keeper's cottage, its crooked walls finely braced, and its hearth left exactly as she'd found it. The hidden passage now a small, respectful marker to Captain Josiah Wren, whose name the town finally spoke with the gratitude it had owed him for 50 years, instead of the careless doubt it had settled. For instead, we began this story with a 20-year-old woman standing outside a door that was never truly going to be opened to her, watching a man who had married into her family cast her out with barely a second thought. We told you she spent $7 on a crooked ruin the whole town had written off as worthless, and we promised you that something hidden behind its hearth would restore not only her own life, but the safety of an entire fishing town. That woman was Clara Voss, and what she found in that narrow stone passage was never really about gold or bonds, not in the way the old dockside rumors had always imagined it. It was a dead captain's honesty finally reaching the people he'd meant it for, and a town's overdue safety finally being paid in full. Clara never sought to ruin the family that had wronged her. She asked only that the truth be allowed to do what the tide always eventually does, wearing patiently away at whatever has been hidden until it stands plain in the light. In the years that followed, Solace Point became known not for its crooked, cursed house on the cliff, but for its sturdy new harbor, and for the young woman who bought a ruin no one else wanted and found, behind its hearth, exactly what 50 years of silence had been waiting to give back. Thank you for staying with us through every step of Clara's story tonight. If her quiet patience and her stubborn refusal to be pushed aside moved you the way they moved us in the telling, we would be so grateful if you would share this story with someone who needs to be reminded that the things others call worthless are so often simply waiting for someone patient enough to look closer. We would love to hear from you. What is a time you found real value in something the rest of the world had already written off? And where in the world are you watching from tonight? Tell us both in the comments below. Until next time, stay close.